What if the man who taught the world that heroes never die was himself running out of reasons to keep fighting? Not from scandal, not from surrender, but from silence. The kind that lingers when applause has long since faded, and purpose feels like an echo you can't chase anymore. At 83, Harrison Ford sits in the cockpit of a de Havilland Beaver, somewhere above Wyoming. Below him stretches the land that once mirrored his soul, vast, scarred, and stubbornly alive. The same sky that watched him become Han Solo, Indiana Jones, Rick Deckard. The same sky that carried him through crashes, marriages, storms. He was never supposed to be a legend. He just wanted to build things with his hands. But fate has a way of mistaking quiet men for heroes. Before the galaxy, before the whip and the fedora, before fame and fear and myth, there was wood and silence. Because his story, like all great American myths, does not begin in light. It begins in dust. Born in Chicago in 1942, Harrison Ford grew up in a world built on rules he couldn't quite follow. His father, Christopher, was an advertising executive who loved words more than feelings. His mother, Dorothy, was a radio actress who filled their home with other people's voices, stories that made emotion sound rehearsed. Young Harrison learned early how to vanish between them. At school, he was shy, invisible. "I was the kind of kid you didn't remember after 5 minutes," he once said in a 1981 Rolling Stone interview. And I was fine with that. He wasn't chasing attention. He was looking for freedom. At 19, he found it in flight. A friend took him to Palwarkey Airport, where the hum of propellers became his first language of peace. "I liked that the world made sense up there," he told GQ decades later. Gravity was honest. It never lied. But life lied all the time. He drifted through college, dropped out, and fell into acting almost by accident. "I didn't want to be famous," he told Vanity Fair. "I just needed work." He was signed by Columbia Pictures' new talent program, but the word talent seemed more hope than fact. Bit parts in forgettable TV shows. Rejected scripts. Directors who told him to smile more, talk less. When the calls stopped, he picked up a hammer instead. Carpentry saved him the way music saved Keith Urban, a craft that kept his hands busy when his heart was tired. He built cabinets for the rich, doors for studios, stages for dreams that weren't his. He called it the only honest work I'd ever done. He could have stayed there forever, quiet, unremarkable, content. Until one afternoon in 1973, a casting director asked him to install some doors for a film called American Graffiti. The director was a 29-year-old dreamer named George Lucas. And fate, for the second time, mistook a carpenter for a hero. When Star Wars arrived in 1977, everything exploded. The man who had once measured his life in inches of wood was now measured in galaxies. The name Han Solo became scripture. He was suddenly every boy's rebellion, every girl's mystery, every studio's property. He hated it. "Fame felt like a theft," he said to Esquire in 1999. "It took the parts of me that were still private and sold them back to me at a price I couldn't afford." He didn't play Han Solo. He survived him. The world called him confident. He called it armor. Beneath the grin and the charm was a craftsman who still built things to keep from breaking. Houses. Planes. Walls. He wanted to disappear. Hollywood wouldn't let him. But then came Indiana Jones, and the myth became irreversible. Spielberg once said, Harrison had that thing, the weight of danger behind the smile. That was the secret. Ford didn't act brave. He was afraid, and that made him believable. The whip, the hat, the fear of snakes, It was all him, perfectly human. Yet even as Indiana conquered screens, Harrison's real life began to crack. The fame that had rebuilt him was now burning through everything he loved: his marriage to Mary Marquardt, his peace, his patience. "I was gone more than I was home," he later told the Los Angeles Times. And when you leave long enough, home stops waiting. By the late 80s, he was a god on screen and a ghost of it. He once said, "I never wanted to be adored. I wanted to be understood." But adoration sells better. He drank more, flew more, worked endlessly. Every film became a war against time. Blade Runner, Witness, The Fugitive, all reflections of a man running from stillness. Critics called him the last real movie star. He called himself a man hiding behind stories. But every hero runs out of scripts eventually. And when the noise of the world grows too loud, even legends need a place to land. The first time Harrison Ford almost died, it wasn't in a movie. March 5, 2015, a small vintage plane, a Ryan PT-22 Recruit, dropped from the sky over a California golf course. Witnesses said it looked like a wounded bird falling in slow motion. The news called it a miracle that he survived. Ford called it a really bad landing. He broke his pelvis, shattered his ankle, cracked his spine, and still, when reporters found him days later, he was already talking about flying again. "The risk is the point," he told the New York Times. "Otherwise, you're just walking around waiting to die." It wasn't arrogance. It was truth. Flying had always been his therapy, a skywide reminder that control was an illusion, but grace was not. He had been running from stillness his whole life. Up there, stillness was all you had. But before the crash, before the headlines, there had been another kind of fall. Slower, quieter, the kind that doesn't break bones but bends the soul. In 2001, after nearly 2 decades of silence, Harrison Ford and Calista Flockhart met at the Golden Globes. She was 22 years younger, the face of Ally McBeal, all light and laughter. He was 60, divorced twice, tired of pretending to enjoy rooms full of noise. Their connection was instant, almost absurd. "We were both loners pretending to be social," she later said. "We recognized the same kind of quiet." The tabloids sneered. Hollywood whispered. But Ford, the man who once avoided interviews like storms, smiled for the first time in years. "I found someone who doesn't need to fix me," he told Parade in 2003. "She just sits beside me and listens to the engines." He adopted her son, Liam, built a house in Wyoming, bought fewer suits, more tools. He stopped playing heroes for applause and started building chairs again, just to feel the weight of something real. When asked what peace looked like, he pointed to his ranch and said, "It looks like work you don't have to explain." By the time Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull premiered in 2008, the world saw a comeback. He saw a mirror. "I'm not nostalgic," he told The Guardian. "The past is heavy. You carry it long enough, it starts to fly the plane." He was aging in a business obsessed with youth, yet somehow his wrinkles became mythic, a living fossil carved by gravity and grit. Where others chased immortality, Ford embraced erosion. He refused Botox, avoided premieres, skipped parties. He preferred engines to red carpets, wind to applause. "You can't play a man who's been through hell," he once said, "unless you've actually been there." Behind the calm, though, was grief that rarely spoke its name. His son Malcolm struggled with addiction. His own brother, Terrence, died quietly in 2008. The losses piled like wreckage in a hangar. But Harrison Ford did what he always did. tightened the bolts, patched the wings, kept flying. You deal with pain the same way you deal with turbulence, he said. You steady your hands and hope the storm passes before you do. Calista stood by him through every repair, emotional and mechanical. She learned the language of weather reports, the smell of fuel on his jacket, the ritual of silence before takeoff. He never says goodbye before he flies, as she told Vanity Fair in 2015. He just says, "See you soon." That's his power. In her quiet way, she grounded him, not by holding him down, but by reminding him what gravity was for. Hollywood still called. And he still answered, though less for fame, more for craft. When Ridley Scott called him back for Blade Runner 2049, Ford hesitated. "I wasn't sure Deckard had anything left to say," he told Empire. "Then I realized neither did I, and that's why I had to do it." It wasn't a performance. It was an autopsy of memory, of identity, of time. He moved through the film like a man already halfway between life and legend. You could feel the silence in him, the kind that no script could fill. When asked how it felt to return to an old ghost, he smiled faintly. "Closure is a myth," he said. "You just learn to carry the open endings." By his late 70s, his body began to protest what his soul still demanded: stunts, flights, control. But even pain seemed small compared to purpose. "I don't act for attention," he said during a 2021 CBS Sunday Morning interview. "I act because I like stories about people who try. That's all I've ever done. Try." He didn't know it, but he had become something rare, a man who aged without apology. A hero who let his silence speak louder than any franchise could. And as the engines hummed beneath him, the same ones that nearly killed him, he finally began to understand that maybe survival was not about staying alive. Maybe it was about staying true. There comes a point in every man's life when applause starts to sound like rain on a roof, distant, rhythmic, and meant for someone else. For Harrison Ford, that moment came quietly, somewhere around his 75th birthday. He no longer needed to prove that he could fly, act, or survive. The only thing left to prove was that he could stop. When he turned down major roles, superhero reboots, franchise spin-offs, nostalgia bait, the studios were confused. He could have done anything, a one executive told Variety. But he just wanted to go home. Home wasn't Hollywood. It was the ranch in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, where mornings began with coffee and the sound of elk across the valley. There, he could fix engines, chop wood, and forget that the world ever expected him to save it. Friends say he moved like a ghost between cabins and sky. He still flew every week, not for thrill, but for rhythm. "Flying is the only time my mind shuts up," he told Esquire in 2022. "I think better up there than I do anywhere else." Calista called it his church. And when he landed, he was gentle again, the same man who once hid behind a sawdust smile. Yet Hollywood never stops calling its ghosts back. In 2023, at 81, he returned as Indiana Jones one last time, not for money, not for legacy, but for closure. The film, The Dial of Destiny, was a goodbye letter disguised as an adventure. Every wrinkle, every tremor of his hand on the whip told the real story, that even icons grow old, and that grace can exist in surrender. On set, director James Mangold described him as the most human man in a room full of myths. Ford didn't want special effects or body doubles. "If it is going to fall," he said, "then I'm the one who falls." He did, twice, actually, injuring his shoulder during filming. The crew panicked. Ford laughed. "I've been falling my whole life," he said. "This time, someone's just paying for it." The audience wept in the final scene, not because Indiana Jones was gone, but because Harrison Ford had allowed him to end. Few actors ever find the courage to bury their own legend. He did, quietly, like a craftsman finishing a final chair and walking away without signing it. After the premiere, a journalist asked him what he would miss most about playing heroes. "Nothing," he said. "Heroes are lonely. I'm done being lonely." That single sentence carried decades of confession, of failed marriages, long shoots, quiet dinners where no one dared ask how he really felt. He was tired of pretending to be indestructible. He was ready to be real. In a later GQ interview, he expanded. "I spent 50 years pretending to be men who always knew what to do. Then I'd go home and not know how to talk to my kids. Acting teaches you to feel for everyone, except yourself." The reporter described his eyes as a clear but heavy, like sky before rain. He once said to a friend, "If fame is a tax on meaning, the more people think they know you, the less you recognize yourself." That line would haunt him during his quietest years. Because for all his sarcasm and stoicism, Harrison Ford's deepest fear was not death, it was irrelevance. But irrelevance never came. Instead, the world rediscovered him as something rarer, an elder who still earned his silence. He joined environmental organizations, funded search and rescue programs, and used his pilot's license to deliver supplies to disaster zones. When reporters asked why, he shrugged. "I broke enough stuff in my life. Time to fix a few things." He refused speeches and cameras. His charity came without headlines. A local volunteer once said, "He shows up, lifts boxes, flies home. No selfies, no press. Just work." That was the carpenter again, the boy who built to stay sane. But beneath the serenity, there were ghosts he never stopped visiting. The death of Carrie Fisher in 2016 had carved a permanent scar. "She was my partner in chaos," he told Vanity Fair. "We fought like siblings and laughed like fools. I miss the laughter." Mark Hamill once said, after Carrie died, Harrison stopped making jokes for a while. That's how you knew it broke him. 4 months, Ford flew aimlessly over Wyoming, landing on lakes, sitting in silence for hours. "I kept hearing her voice," he said. "Still do sometimes." Pain never truly leaves men like him. It just changes altitude. By 2024, his world had narrowed to essentials: Calista, his son Liam, his hangar, the sound of wind through pine. He took fewer scripts, more walks. Stopped reading reviews. Stopped pretending that legends had to be eternal. He told CBS Mornings, "People think heroes die on screen. They don't. They just retire quietly into real life." Maybe that's braver. And maybe it was. Because even as his hands trembled and the world grew faster than his eyes could follow, he never stopped trying to be decent. Not perfect. Just decent. The carpenter had come full circle. Fame, when it lingers too long, becomes a mirror that won't stop talking. And Harrison Ford had spent half a century learning to look away. By the mid-2020s, the industry had shifted. New stars, new faces, new myths. But Ford didn't mourn the past. "I'm happy to be outdated," he told The Hollywood Reporter in 2024. "It means I lasted long enough to see what comes next." He was still working, but selectively, almost poetically. When Marvel called to offer him the role of Thaddeus Ross in Captain America: Brave New World, he hesitated. "Do I look like a man who wants to wear tights?" he joked. Then, after a pause, "But I do like stories about responsibility." He took the part, not for spectacle, but for something quieter, closure with the idea of power itself. Ross is a man who spent his life chasing control, he said. I know what that feels like. He had learned that fame, like flight, is only graceful when you understand the cost of gravity. And gravity had taken its due. There were mornings when his hands ached too much to hold a wrench, when his voice rasped like old wood. Calista would smile and brew coffee, pretending not to notice the tremor. He would kiss her shoulder and whisper, "Is still flying." They had been together for more than 20 years. No scandals. No dramatic declarations. Just a steady warmth that came from mutual exhaustion and a shared reverence for quiet. She doesn't want the legend, he told People in 2025. She just wants the man who cleans up after the horses. And that, somehow, made him immortal in a different way. For all his toughness, Harrison Ford had become one of Hollywood's most openly sentimental men. When he received a Lifetime Achievement honor at Cannes, he stood on stage, visibly trembling, not from nerves, but disbelief. He didn't thank agents or producers. He thanked carpenters. They taught me that when something breaks, he said, voice cracking, you don't throw it away. You fix it. It was the simplest line of the night, and the only one the audience kept quoting. Because it sounded like a secret we had all forgotten. His friends noticed something else. He had started smiling again, the rare full smile that once belonged to a smuggler and an archaeologist. But it wasn't showmanship anymore. It was release. A pilot friend said, he flies lower now. Slower. Not for thrill, for gratitude. He was done chasing the wind. Now he was listening to it. There were rumors that he was writing a memoir. He denied it. I'm not interested in telling my story, he said. Stories are meant to be found, not explained. But those close to him whispered that he kept journals, hundreds of them, filled with flight logs, sketches of planes, pieces of dialogue scribbled next to grocery lists. Not a record of fame, but of living. Because that was always his rebellion, to remain human in a world that wanted him to be myth. When an interviewer asked him what he feared most, he didn't say death or decline. He said, a noise. The world's too loud, he explained. It drowns out the good stuff, kindness, patience, humor. I'd rather disappear than become part of the noise. And maybe that was his final lesson to the culture that once built him, that disappearing isn't failure. It's a form of grace. But life, stubborn as always, kept pulling him back into the light. In late 2025, he appeared at a small aviation charity gala in Santa Monica. The audience expected stories about stunts, about Spielberg, about near misses. Instead, he talked about mercy. Every time I've walked away from a crash, he said, I've wondered why I was allowed to. Maybe the answer's simple, to help someone else walk away from theirs. The room went silent. It wasn't the kind of speech that wins standing ovations. It was the kind that makes people go home and think. At 83, Harrison Ford was no longer trying to be remembered. He was trying to be useful. He volunteered as an aviation mentor for young pilots. Donated quietly to wildfire relief funds. And on weekends, he carved small wooden birds in his hangar, painting them by hand, each one signed only with an EH. He gave them away to children at the local airfield. When asked why, he said, "Is so they remember the flying starts on the ground." He was still the same man, still wry, still sharp, still carrying a little of that Han Solo smirk. But beneath it all was a tenderness he no longer bothered to hide. He'd learned that strength doesn't mean silence. It means knowing when to speak gently. In the quiet hours before dawn, the hangar smells of fuel and pine. The sky above Wyoming hums with the slow birth of morning, and Harrison Ford, pilot, carpenter, reluctant icon, checks the wings of his old plane as though touching a prayer. He doesn't fly for thrill anymore. He flies for balance. If I stay on the ground too long, he once said, I start hearing ghosts. And there are many now. Friends gone. Co-stars buried. Whole eras fading like contrails in the blue. Yet the strange grace of age is that grief stops being sharp. It becomes soft, a companion, not a wound. He wears it like an old leather jacket, creased, weathered, but warm. When a young reporter recently asked him if he ever thinks about legacy, Ford smiled, eyes narrowing like a man amused by his own survival. Legacy's a word for people who aren't busy enough, he said. I've still got fences to mend. But then, after a pause, or if someone remembers me, I hope it's for the work, not the noise. That line spread across the internet, clipped, quoted, meme-ified, but most missed what he meant. He wasn't dismissing greatness. He was redefining it. Greatness, for him, was finishing what you start. Building what breaks. Loving quietly. Landing safely. In a culture obsessed with ascent, he became the man who made descent look beautiful. He has grown slower, but not smaller. When he walks, it's with the heavy calm of someone who has outlived both expectation and ego. At interviews, he laughs at questions about fame. At home, he reads weather maps like scripture. Calista still teases him for mumbling through compliments. Their son is grown now, flying his own path. The family's life is measured not in premieres but in dinners, repairs, seasons. Peace is boring, he said once. That's why it's worth fighting for. He meant it. After decades of pretending to save the world, he'd finally learned how to save an afternoon, by fixing a gate, sanding a wing, teaching a kid how to hold a wrench. The boy who once wanted to disappear into wood grain had built himself back into something solid. In 2026, when the Smithsonian asked to display one of his flight jackets beside the Millennium Falcon cockpit replica, he declined. It still fits, he said. Then, after a long pause, and maybe when I'm done flying. But everyone knows he will never be done. Flying isn't a hobby for him. It's a dialogue with everything he can't explain. Each takeoff is a question. Each landing, a confession. He doesn't chase clouds anymore. He follows light. The kind that breaks quietly through the horizon after a long night. And perhaps that's the final truth about Harrison Ford, that beneath the legend, beneath the leather and sarcasm, he is a craftsman of silence. He builds it, protects it, lives in it. The world made him a symbol of courage, but his real bravery was gentleness, staying when he could have fled, loving when he could have hidden, returning to the sky after it tried to kill him. He never gave us perfection. He gave us persistence. And that's rarer. In his last public interview of 2025, the host asked him how he'd like to be remembered. He leaned back, smiled faintly, and said, "As someone who tried to do the right thing, even when it wasn't interesting." Then he laughed, that low, gravelly sound that has carried through half a century of cinema, and looked away, already finished with the moment. Because that's who he is, the man who leaves before the applause, who walks out of the frame just as history tries to freeze him. He taught the world that adventure isn't about youth, or fame, or glory. It's about courage, the courage to age, to forgive, to stay kind. He taught us that silence can roar louder than engines. That strength can live in the way a hand steadies after a storm. That heroes grow old, and sometimes that's the happiest ending of all. So if this story moved you, don't send him flowers or questions. Send stillness. Send kindness. Send the reminder that the sky is big enough for second chances, and that sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is land. Because the boy who once built chairs to survive, who became a hero by accident, who fell from the sky and rose anyway, has already given us his final lesson. You don't need to be fearless to fly. You just need to keep taking off. And as the hangar doors open to morning, the old plane hums to life one more time. Light spills across the valley. The world holds its breath. And somewhere above the clouds, Harrison Ford smiles, not as a legend, not as an icon, but as a man finally at peace with the silence that made him whole.